Hello and welcome to the Food and Agriculture Pavilion. Today actually marks the second week of COP, and I hope you're all energized for what's coming. We have a couple of days that are going to be quite dense around food and nature, but very much looking forward to this. So thank you for joining this session this afternoon. I'm Dana Michalon, and I'm manager at OP2B, the One Planet Business for Biodiversity Coalition. And OP2B is a project from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and is an action-oriented coalition that gathers 32 businesses, leading businesses that are focusing on restoring biodiversity loss by scaling up regenerative agriculture. So we're very happy to see that COP28 has actually put front and center the food agenda. And we're very much also happy to see the links that are happening with the climate agenda at the same time. A great example was on December 1st with the Emirates leaders' declaration on resilient food systems, sustainable agriculture, and climate action. And it was supported by 134 countries. And the great news is that it was supported by the large food producing companies, large producing countries such as Brazil, China, and the US. And we very much welcome the link that clearly made between this transition that needs to happen with the much needed financing support to allow for such a transition to happen. So today's discussion is, as you can see from the title, moving from shallow to deep commitments. And we're going to have two panels to discuss what are the challenges that are hindering these commitments, specifically on regenerative agriculture, and moving into these new sustainable forms of agriculture. You might have heard these last weeks, and to be honest, this last year, the great momentum around regenerative agriculture, as it's popping up as one of the solutions that can be quite holistic, because it allows for climate, nature, and most importantly, livelihoods benefits. So it's on this holistic dimension that we'd like to focus the discussion today. And as I mentioned, we'll have two panels. One panel that's quite focused on some companies that will be telling us about the challenges that they're facing, and we'll have another panel focusing more on the financing needs and the shifts in policy as well. And between each panel, we'll have a Q&A session for all of you here to ask some questions. So without any further ado, I want to ask Ewan Andrew, President, Global Supply and Procurement, and Chief Sustainability Officer at Diageo, Hanne Sondergaard, Executive Vice President and Chief Agriculture and Sustainability Officer at Arla Food, and Keith Aguada, CEO and co-founder of Producers Trust, to join me. Thank you for all of you three to join us today for this conversation. For this first panel, I would like us to focus the discussion on one important topic that has been a top priority for OP2B members, and that's focusing on corporate accountability and metrics around regenerative agriculture. We do know that regenerative agriculture is very much context-specific, and there's a big need to shift from practice-based to outcomes-based. But more importantly, there's a big need to all of us to converge on how do we measure those outcomes. And so today's discussion, I'd love to kickstart with you, Ewan, actually, if we can pass you the mic. Thank you. Perfect. So, Ewan, I think that we have seen from scientific evidence and also from results on the ground the benefits that can be generated from regenerative agriculture. And so it shows us today the legitimacy to move from conventional to regenerative production. So we'd like to see from Diageo's perspective, what's the rationale between the shift of Diageo to regenerative agriculture, and if there are specific technical challenges that you're facing.
Sure. So hello, everyone. Look, what I would say is that Diageo is a global business operating in more than 200 countries, and I think about my crop types. I have over 40 different crop types that are feeding through my process. But you had it in your introduction across climate, nature, people, and communities. And I think Diageo deeply believes, and our consumers are not what's driving this yet. You know, yes, our shareholders, but our customers, our suppliers, our employees, the communities in which we operate are all kind of pushing in the area around about what are we doing on water and what are we doing on carbon. And I'd say that these things do come together in that intersectionality as much as anywhere in regenerative agriculture. And what we have to think about as a business is that for us to have long-term sustainable growth, you know, we follow the donut economics model, right? So you want to be within the planet's boundaries, and you want to operate, you want to lift up society, and in the middle, you want to continue to make, you know, profit for your shareholders, a successful business for the communities that you operate in. And if you take an area like water, in particular, it's the lifeblood of our business. So if there's going to be less of it available in the future, and you've got food crops that are going to be under more and more pressure, and we use a food crop to make, you know, a premium product that isn't necessary for life, we have to make sure that society is leading, and we have to be a leading force, you know, driven across that. Some of the technical challenges that we have as a business as we look to scale it quickly come around about the obvious areas of, you know, comparability and being able to get the data to make sure it's sized appropriately so that you're pushing the right amount of resources and investment, to make sure we know who to collaborate with, that have, you know, common goals in certain landscapes. And we've been very focused on our business for decades about, you know, our internal water efficiency and use of water, decarbonizing our operations. We've made huge strides in that. But if the problem is in the catchment or it's in the landscape and it's at that level, you know, if it runs dry or if a government comes in and regulates you differently, we haven't got a sustainable business. So we deeply believe in that. And then I think we're a very inclusive company. We operate in very mature markets and in very developing markets. And if I take areas like Africa, you know, we know that if you stand for inclusivity and you stand for women, then water is your key to unlocking economic development, security for women, growth for women. So it all comes together, and definitely in the fields, it's much more than just carbon.
Thank you for sharing. Those are, I would say, perhaps challenges that are quite regularly seen across the value chain. But moving to you, Hanne, Arla has a very specific position in the agriculture value chain. You're very close to the farmers, and perhaps you're witnessing some challenges, or your member corporates are witnessing some challenges that are different, and it would be helpful for us to understand what's Arla's drive behind the shift to regenerative agriculture, and what are some of those challenges that are specific?
Yes, thank you very much, and also very pleased to be here. For those who don't know Arla, we are indeed a farmer cooperative. We are owned by 8,500 dairy farmers in Northern Europe. And I guess we are also classifying ourselves as a how company when it comes to sustainability. So we are very obsessed about how we make things happen on farm. And we have been on climate, and now we're gradually moving on to nature. We have a number of things that we're doing now. We want this to be a farmer-led journey. So therefore, we're working very close with our farmers on what does this actually mean. We have 24 pilot farms. They've been on this journey for a couple of years. We are collecting data from them. They're experimenting with all the different practices. And I think what we're learning is that what's very important to them is three things. One is that they have coaching to the journey. They have support to the journey. There's an ecosystem around them that supports them. You know, when the weather gets bad, you need to know what to do. That they can exchange knowledge with each other, because this is an uncomfortable space for them to go into. They're changing practices that have been embedded in dairy farming for many years. And that we collect data and learn from those data. I think for us, what we have learned on the climate journey is the ecosystem around the farmers is crucial. So we need to build that up in our key countries, and that's what we are very focused on. I also think that what we are also meeting only from those 24 is that sometimes you take action that actually then reduces your opportunity to get some of the subsidies that are currently there. So we also need to get alignment between, in European context, the subsidies that are paid out to farmers and where we want to get to on nature and regenerative agriculture. I think for us, we are very keen on establishing a way to scale. And we know that the way to scale is that we can measure it, that we have clear targets, that we can incentivize it. And we have, our farmers have decided to put up to 500 million euro behind climate a year. And now we need to move gradually also to look at what do we need to do on nature. But we believe if you don't put money on it, it's not going to happen. And then we need to commercialize it, I think, because money needs to be coming into it as well.
No, thank you for sharing the farmer perspective. We do know that today the biggest challenges and the biggest burdens are on the farmers' shoulders. And so also by you're reminding us that we need to keep a farmer-centric approach. And this is a great segue for me to quickly tell you about Region 10, the multi-stakeholder initiative that is focusing on farmers and bridging this gap that has been, sad to say, has been present for quite some time. This multi-stakeholder initiative is looking to drive a holistic approach to regenerate food systems by keeping the farmers at the center. And WBCSD is actually a very proud partner of Region 10, and we're responsible for the private sector engagement there. What we're trying to do is also converge as a private sector behind those very farmer-centric principles and hopefully metrics. But moving to you, Keith, we've heard from Arla and Diageo some of the challenges that large corporations are facing. And we know that Producers Trust, you work with cooperatives on building large-scale regenerative landscape projects. Can you tell us a bit more about those and if you are also facing some challenges of your own?
Yeah, thank you. And nice to see everyone. And it's great to be on a panel with two corporates who are walking the walk. So congrats to both of you all. And the point you led with is farmer-centric. And Producers Trust, we're a global network of agricultural producers. We organize them through on-the-ground partnerships in the Global South in order to get to the farmers, help them organize their data and products to bring to market. And it starts with farmers and understanding the farmers' needs. Most of the farmers we talk to want to make more money. And that is usually the conversation. And in some cases, it's adapting to a changing climate or limited resources. So what we're working to do is bridge the demand and the need from the corporate side, the buyer, the offtake side, which is data validated, regenerative or sustainable goods, and keeping pricing in a level that allows for being competitive on the market. And so the way we're looking at getting to the source and transitioning large numbers of farmers into better practices is through incentivizing. And the first incentive is offtake agreements. And long-term acquisition of offtake can de-risk an ecosystem around the small farmers. Extension services through UNDP or USAID or other financing. Private and public partnership infrastructure financing, which is required. So needing to get more nurseries, so there can be agroforestry in cacao or coffee systems. Input manufacturing for biochar and biologicals that can reach farmers. Training centers so farmers can come in and train. And so what we're looking at is a paradigm in which the corporates can lead from the front without needing to actually invest capital. It's about actually shifting the way in which they're doing procurement and starting to go more directly with and without the commodity traders who may or may not be working for the best interests of the small farmers, and starting to consider how their long-term offtake de-risks and attracts private capital to come into otherwise risky scenarios. And then the organization of the data of the farmers is a result of the practices and outcomes. And the data that gets organized and collected has to also be driven by what are the business requirements of the brands and retailers. And so we're mapping out and trying to understand the complexity of these ecosystems. But what we're seeing is that there's an incredible opportunity for brands and retailers to be clear on what the requirements are in terms of sustainability and data. And secondly, to start to find creative ways to guarantee future offtakes to de-risk the transitions and the investments into these practices.
Well, thank you, Keith. It's actually a great example to hear what you're doing, because we do know there's a lack of alignment on the metrics today in the private sector. And so it's good to see that although we don't have this alignment yet, I'll tell you a bit more about that shortly, it's good to see that you are able to implement those projects. So we can't wait to have the perfect solution on metrics, but at the same time, we can work on scaling regenerative projects and hopefully generate those outcomes that are very much holistic. So this is a great segue for me to the next round of questions that I have. And Ewan, I would love to know from you, this lack of alignment across the industry, how does that impact you in Diageo, and how do you feel that an alignment can support you in developing those more deeper or holistic commitments in the future?
Yep. So look, what Keith was saying, in terms of the farmer-centricity and what that means, I'll tell you a real story, right? Rather than give you a corporate line of words. Essentially, when I've been on the farms, and it could be rice farms in India, it could be sorghum farms in Africa, agave in Mexico, or barley in Scotland, across Scotch whiskey, tequila, whatever. There's two consistent things come through from the farmers on the field, okay? One is that business is too far away from the field. So back to the point on, traders, merchants, commodities markets. And the second piece is, clearly from a farmer's perspective, they've got more than just me to supply. So, we have the ability to collaborate in a way that drives regenerative practices, does make more margin, gives stability to the farmer, and consistency year in, year out that encourages them to want their family to follow, rather than sell their farm because their children don't want to work as hard as they saw their parents. So one of the ways, if I think of it, is that I've got people to collaborate with that are growing flax for fashion, oats for Pepsi and Quaker, maybe, or potatoes for McCain Foods, barley for me. And we're able to come together in a landscape network and essentially stack the financing and say, rather than my board saying, why does Diageo have to pay for all that and carry the premium of the extra margin or incentive for the farmer, when I can share it in the landscape with all the different actors. And that even stretches right out beyond the conservationists or the other big business. You get insurance companies, right, who are trying to deal with flooding. And we talked about it's not just carbon. So if they're having to see their premiums rise for their customers and their consumers and a cost of living, that's not good for their sustainability of their business. If they can reduce the flood risks by contributing to better use of the land, and it's about the water retention and the management of the fields with the farmers, this intersectionality really does pay off. And the program we're working with at the moment is one called Lens, which is really kind of growing, I'd say, scale and pace in Europe, and starting to move elsewhere. We're taking it to Mexico for tequila, where it essentially puts in an area coordinator. All of the people that want to fund and act go in. They pay the farmers to grow and to provide the data and to manage the systems. And then essentially the commodities market still works alongside that with offtake agreements based on what's the price of the product you're buying. So this is the realities of the technical challenges, but I have a lot of faith now in the momentum of the common goal and people coming together.
Well, thank you, Ewan. And perhaps, Hani, are there any specific challenges linked to the dairy sector that you're facing in Arla, specifically perhaps linked also to this misalignment on metrics across the industry?
Yeah, so I think what we are doing in dairy, let's say, is that we are trying to create a outcome-based set of standards, working based on all the work done in OP2B and now in SCI. So we are basically picking that up and saying specifically for dairy, how do we create outcomes for dairy farms that we make sure that when farmers, if we ask farmers to deliver on those, that's going to have the impact on water, that's going to have the impact on biodiversity that we are looking for. That's not easy, but we are at a stage now where we have a framework, and we are taking it out to farms next year to pilot it. And going back to data, of course, that's more data that we want to collect, and also on the financial side of what does it actually mean. And then I think, again, once we have that, then we need to be going into the wheel of setting ambitions where we have everyone with us. And I think one thing that is key for us, and I actually think that's an important point as well, is we sometimes talk about regenerative as a standard. I think it's very important that this becomes an inclusive journey that all farmers can be on. And whatever type of farm you are to start with, there are things you can do on your farm to move in this direction. So it's not necessarily a question of whether you are regenerative or not regenerative, but it's more a question of what practices can you do to achieve some outcomes on your farm. And that will be different farm for farm. So let's embrace all the diversity of farming that we have. I think that's key as well.
Definitely, and thank you for sharing, both of you, actually, those challenges. It's perhaps a good time to tell you all about the great effort, collective effort that is undergoing in the private sector. So this year, OP2B and WBCSD has launched a convening space where more 50 companies and 27 business-oriented organizations, representing in total more than 1,100 businesses, came together in order to align across the industry on how do we measure the outcomes from regenerative agriculture. And this work is feeding into the Region 10 initiative. So making sure that we pass it back to a farmer-centric setting. So very important that we're doing that in the private sector, but also in the multi-stakeholder sector by putting those farmers at the center of this shift.
Can I just make one very small point? Because yes. I think in addition to that, we also have to pick it up in our sectors. Because I think it is specific whether you are dairy. I know we need to work on landscapes, but I also think we need to understand what does it mean for a dairy farm? What does it mean for another type of farm?
Definitely. I think this alignment needs to happen on multiple levels for it to be successful. And we do know the efforts that are happening in some sectors, and also from the collaboration across sectors and coalitions and in convening spaces. But this year, with this collective effort, this group of 50 companies and 27 business partners have aligned. First, I want to make it very clear that the first step was on the climate outcomes. And we are happy to share that today we've published the results of this alignment. And by early 2024, we'll be publishing the nature alignment and the equity alignment coming by mid-2024. So all of these efforts are being, I would say, picked up by companies because we do know that by aligning on metrics, this will allow us to move into valuation and then move the conversation to more financing and the public and the advocacy challenges that we have today. So, but this is for in a couple of minutes. I want to go back to you, Keith, and see if now you've heard that this collective effort is happening. Can you tell us a bit more on how this alignment can also support you in monitoring and tracking the progress and what needs to happen as well?
Definitely, and building off from what I just heard, that landscape network concept is so critical because the products that are coming from a farm might go to different buyers that are non-competitive or even competitive, right? And for the farming groups to know what data needs to go to which markets makes the collection organization of data a lot more efficient and will also lower costs for the downstream brands. So I think landscape network approach is what farmers want to hear and will lead to higher profits and also will lower the costs to organize data, and then those costs can be spread out. And the data that gets organized will, again, depend on business requirements. Remote sensing, which is very low cost, can only go so far. We need to actually get to the farm level and reach farmers. And depending upon what are the requirements of what needs to be validated, having someone who shows up to the farm and documents, records, and then maybe even having an auditor becomes mandatory. And so what we're looking at is how do we leverage the folks who are already going to the farms to work with farmers and equipping them with the capacity and the digital tools to become data agents. So we're looking at how do we capture and organize data at a marginal cost, leveraging the farm extension services that are already reaching these rural communities. And the other point, which was made brilliantly, is inclusivity. Most farmers that I know who use chemicals and GMOs and things that maybe regenerative folks don't love so much, they're doing it because they're trying their best. They're trying to stay in business. And it's what they know, it's what they've been taught, it's what they're educated on, and it's their practices. So I think it's important that we do create this inclusive, opening, non-threatening environment so that we can start to benchmark. So we can at least know where we're starting from and having more accurate data so that when the scope 3 reporting or the reports that come in the ESGs and the compliance, that at least it's based around actual data from the source and not inferred data.
Well, thank you for making this point, Keith, because I think you've mentioned the highlights of this discussion today. The key takeaways we can take from this first panel is, first of all, we need to align on how do we measure the outcomes, not the practices, from regenerative agriculture. We need to do so at a farm level, a landscape level, a global level, so linking them into corporate reporting and disclosure. But also, this needs to be very much farmer-centric. And so with that, I would like to thank you for being part of the conversation today. Thank you for sharing your stories as well. We always love those. Thank you. And now well, I'm sorry, there was a glitch. We do have a quick Q&A. You can stay in your places if you would like to. I don't want to, yeah, but let's see if there are some questions in the audience here.
Thank you. It's very heartening to hear that we need to go down to the farm level, involve the farmers and make it more inclusive. But we are not there yet, right? But when we talk about the farmers, I think another aspect that we have got to look into is there are good intention action which are happening, right? Some from the corporate sector, some from the governments. However, they have impacts which are not desirable, right? So we think that this is a good thing. This is really going to help, whether in climate or any other objective. But actually, when you go down to the level, it's harming the people who are there. And I talk from a very specific perspective of indigenous people, right? Whenever we go in there for, let's say at this moment, there is quite a very interesting and a very welcome step from the corporates to increase forested areas. And I come from Northeast India, where there's a small part of this project is going in, and the idea is to afforest in what are called as degraded lands. But we know that state doesn't have degraded lands. These are fallows of indigenous people's communities. So the involvement and understanding of what the issues are at the ground level are very important. And I think we need to also see how can we broaden out the space to bring in the indigenous people in the thinking and in the designing. It was more a comment than a question.
No, but thank you for sharing the very important perspective coming from indigenous people and local communities. So we've discussed in the first, oh, sorry. Another question in the back? Can we make it a brief one?
Yes, it's a brief one. There are so many claims that this is a regeneration, this is not. and nobody knows what it is. What are the parameters? What are the monitoring systems? And how do we monitor changes from where we are? And I think that is where a major gap exists all over. So, you know, and I think the first, probably most important investment is, you know, what are those parameters from the outcome perspective that we need to consider? Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing, because aligning on metrics is one thing, adopting them and then measuring, reporting, and verification is an important step that we need to move into. But we've discussed the lack of alignment and how it affects the deeper holistic commitments that we can take around regenerative agriculture. I would love to now move the conversation to the finance and the policy challenges that are linked to those commitments. So with that, I would like to invite on stage Peter Elwin, Director of Fixed Income, Head of Food and Land Use Program at Planet Tracker, Rob Cameron, Global Head of Public Affairs and ESG from Nestlé, and Sarah Farley, Vice President for the Food Initiative at the Rockefeller Foundation. Thank you for joining us, all three of you today, to focus more now the discussion on the financing needs and the policy needs as well. And so we've made it, I mean, the lack of alignment on metrics was quite clear as a first roadblock, but we do know that in order to move to valuation, we need to first address that hurdle and then move to the valuation to unlock the financing needs that are quite big in order to finance this transition and de-risk it for farmers at the same time, which will also help unlock at the same time the policy needs as well. So my first question, Rob, is to you. We've seen in a recent report in FAIR that a lot of companies are talking about regenerative agriculture, but less than 8% are actually putting the investments to support farmers in getting them the financing that they need, the knowledge that they need, and the markets as well, in order for this transition to be fair and just to them. Can you tell us a bit more about what Nestlé is doing on that front?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. I will. But I want to pick up on the point here because it creates a nice segue into the discussion. In the case of forests, we have some history in terms of we started on ending deforestation specifically in 2010. And as we moved through the teens, actually that word landscapes came into play because what we realized was that we needed to take a landscapes approach to ending deforestation. But most important was when we moved from ending deforestation to what we call forest positive. And the forest positive approach actually, front and center, stops talking about forests and it starts talking about rights, people's rights right to a livelihood, human rights, land rights. Then you can get across addressing deforestation. And I think that's really important learning because I don't know who represents a corporate. I did a panel this morning and I asked everybody to put their hand up if they work for a corporate. A veritable forest of hands went up. Next question was, keep your hand up if you have a time-bound end deforestation commitment. And an awful lot of arms were chopped down pretty quickly. And I was really surprised, but it reflects the data. The same could be said when it comes to regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of commitments out there, which is terrific. We want to see that. But actually, I'm not sure about how much there is in the way of delivery. Now, in our case, we made 3 commitments very rapidly, all kind of connected. I wish I could say they were designed in this way, but they do come together. First was net zero, and I won't bore you with all of that. You know the drill, 50% by 2030, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, we made the same sort of commitment when it comes to regenerative agriculture. We're not going to get to where we want to be on net zero without regenerative agriculture. 50% of our ingredients will be sourced through regenerative practices by 2030. And the reason for this is because pretty much all of our emissions are scope 3. Most of them are in agriculture. We are a business that depends upon nature. We depend upon agriculture. It's the core infrastructure for us. Sidebar, when we invest in any plant machinery, to your point about finance, if we build a factory, it's capital expenditure, goes on the balance sheet. Doesn't come out of this year's P&L, gets depreciated over time. Everything we do on regenerative agriculture is OPEX, it comes out of this year's P&L. Let no one tell me that's not an obstacle, because it is. The way we account for what we're doing is an obstacle. That having been said, specifically, we did make a commitment of 1.2 billion Swiss francs to catalyze the thing, and that's our money going into it, and we deploy that money in various ways. It goes in technical assistance, can go in loans. We also pay, obviously, premiums. Increasingly, we're not just paying premiums for regenerative practices, we're paying for social outcomes as well. So in the case of the Income Accelerator in cocoa in Côte d'Ivoire and now in Ghana, we're rolling out a program that says if your kids are in school, you get a bonus. So we're not just paying a premium for good cocoa, we're paying for social outcomes. We pay for good agroforestry, we pay for pruning, good practices, we pay for income diversification, which then will lead to growth, obviously, for the farmer. And we do it across genders to make sure there's a gender component in there as well. We do this with Diageo, interestingly, with Lens. Very much part of that. We might get into that again. So we're putting our money where our mouth is, and we're paying. But we are not at scale yet. And that's why this scale thing is so important. And the action agenda for regenerative landscapes announced the other day, which we may get to, is so important as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, for sharing an example of what Nestle is doing. But we do know that it's not just up to large multinationals to invest in regenerative agriculture. And some other actors in and around the agricultural value chain need to also step up and help de-risk this transition, which is very much, I mean, today the risks are mostly on the shoulders of the farmers. And so, Peter, I'm turning to you because you recently published a report on financial markets roadmap for food system transformation. I'd love to hear from you a bit more on the role of financial institutions in supporting not only the data collection efforts, but also in strengthening the accountability around regenerative agriculture, and how can this allow them to also step it up when it comes to investing more and supporting that transition?
Yeah, it's good questions, and I think Rob's illustration of deforestation, actually, if you look at the financial institutions that are backing large and small companies in the food system, their policies on deforestation are even worse. So if you were talking to a room full of financiers and asked them to put their hands down, most of their hands would go down. So there's a lot to be done on the financial side, just simply to get financial institutions to step up to the plate and really hold themselves to account, be accountable for the way they're allocating capital and the requirements they're imposing on the companies they're actually funding. And that would obviously then apply to regenerative agriculture as well. I mean, in the report that you were asking about, Danny, that we put out a little while ago, we were asking financial institutions to focus on a number of core actions. We want them to do a whole bunch of sort of fairly big things, but again, our experience with financial institutions, they're time poor, they're very focused on sort of, specifics. So if you ask them to do something big and strategic, it can take an enormously long time. If you give them specific actions to look at, then they tend to respond potentially more quickly. We want them to focus on stopping deforestation. We want them to focus on halving food loss and waste. We want them to focus on cutting methane. So there's a bunch of things they need to do to really sort of bring down the footprint of the food system. But there's also a bunch of things they can do to really invest in improving the food system, transforming it. Traceability in supply chains. One very simple, well, it's conceptually simple, practically quite difficult, but very necessary. Again, Rob was mentioning scope 3, the sort of all the stuff that's going on in the supply chain. A large company like Nestle can't know that unless they've got the systems in place to actually ask the questions and gather the data. And unfortunately, far too few companies have those systems in place. Again, our research actually shows, and I don't know whether this is your experience, Rob, that putting these systems in place is profitable. You've got clearer visibility over your supply chain. You cut down on fraud. Your working capital management is actually much more efficient, and so on and so forth. So it makes economic sense. So traceable supply chains, regenerative agriculture, they need to actually begin to support that, to invest in it. Again, because here we have a system where if you actually invest in the capital base, it improves. There's almost no other industry out there. If you buy a car plant, it depreciates. However well you treat your factory, it depreciates. The food system doesn't do that. Soil gets better. The yields go up. So regenerative agriculture. Alternative proteins. a whole massive spectrum from sort of, insects to sort of lab grown, have it in a vat, or simply plants rather than industrial beef. All of those sorts of things also really important. Again, investment opportunities. So really what we need the financial sort of markets, the financial system to do is to take off its blinkers, stop thinking in narrow, siloed, sort of focused, old-fashioned ways, and really start thinking about a transformed food system. That's going to be the key.
No, thank you for sharing, Peter. We do know that financial institutions are data-driven, and well, earlier this year, OPTB and the Boston Consulting Group launched a paper on the business case for farmers for the transition of regenerative agriculture, and we did see that there is a positive business case. There is a 15 to 25 return on investments under favorable conditions. But if you put that in the larger scale and consider the cost of inaction, then the math is simple. So we're really looking for the financial institutions to step up. But I want to move on to Sarah. And Sarah, by being part of the Rockefeller Foundation as a philanthropic organization and actually a major donor to the transformation of the food system, you have a unique position when as you are close with governments, the private sector, the financial institution, the civil society. So what I would love to hear from you is, we do know that there are finance and policy dimensions that hinder the full scale to transition to more regenerative systems. And so can you walk us through some of these challenges, but mostly can you tell us a bit about the efforts that are being developed?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for creating the space for this conversation, which is so critical. And it's a challenge because what we're talking about is alignment across worldviews, really, that are quite distinct between indigenous communities, farmers, corporates, finance, philanthropy, and even science. So, kind of zooming out and looking at some of the key barriers on the policy and the financing front. Right now, we have a completely incoherent policy enabling environment for this transition. Like, the pieces simply don't add up. We actually, as philanthropy, just did a calculation that was launched on December 1st to answer a question that I think for all of us fighting for this transition had been dogging our ability to make a really compelling case, which is, what is the cost of the very thing we're talking about? We really haven't had a compelling number. So as a group of 24 philanthropies, we did analysis for the last half year, and our number put forward, and this is without a livestock transition, which is a massive asterisk. And the only reason it's not included is because the data was simply too flimsy to feel we could credibly put it forward. So take out that massive piece. $250 to $430 billion a year is the transition to regenerative over at least 10 years. Right? So we're talking about 4.3 trillion. I think we should just look at the high end of the number. How much is going in already? So already we calculate there's about 44 billion a year going to this transition. Money is flowing. But then to the question of what of the policy, what of the finance? When you actually examine that funding, much of it is going to what we would call shallow. And per the title here of this conversation, these are dollars that are really trying to finance a shift from industrial, more chemically input dependent, fossil fuel dependent, frankly, agriculture to more optimizing on both the soil health and the GHG sequestration. These are, that's a massive shift. It's a wonderful shift. But I would argue it does just leave us right there in the shallow end, because the additional benefits, which can be quantified to biodiversity and to water, and then for people, whether that's in the form of equity, well-being, deeper connection to territory, even spiritual connection for communities, territories, landscape dwellers, these are all benefits that right now both policy and frankly the financial mechanisms themselves are quite blind to. So there's a few challenges that are all interconnected here and some wins, I think, in the sales. One challenge is, as we're looking at some of the failures of the carbon market, there's a lot of nervousness if carbon markets still aren't managing to get the level of traceability and transformation, especially for indigenous communities. What are the odds we're going to get a biodiversity credit, a water credit, an equity credit? That feels really daunting. And I think even more challenging, credits and financial mechanisms that actually reward these things together. And I think there, instead of being daunted by the scary notion of what we don't have, I think there's a real space for innovation. Innovating new financial mechanisms and structures that reward more, put more incentives on the deep end than on the shallow end. And in that way, you know, validating what some of the previous speakers, Hannah was speaking to, of like, this isn't binary. There is no switch you flip and Diageo's corporate supply chain goes from shallow to deep. No, it is continuous improvement. And for each step, for each additional outcome that is not only measured and optimized for, but verified, there should be more incentives. First and foremost for the farmers and the landscape stewards, but for the entire totality. So as philanthropy, I think we do have a role to play here, both to bring some of these players, especially where we're leaning as a collective of 24 philanthropies together. We call ourselves RAFT. Where RAFT can go is to take this conversation of the missing financial models and the appetite, I think, from off-takers and corporates to get into sourcing relationships that remunerate for more of a deep perspective, create the spaces where we can have a farmer-centric and landscape-centric conversation about what it would look like. Let's do it in real places. And for RAFT, what we're finding is there's a lot of energy and frankly a lot of financing around Brazil, India, East Africa, US. And I think those give 4 really concrete places to start to test drive some new models.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for mentioning the incentives that need first and foremost to be addressed to farmers. We do know that when we talk on the policy level, repurposing environmentally harmful subsidies is an important point. But we do know there are other challenges that are also emerging from the policy side, and those are the emerging regulations. And so, Rob, I'd love to hear from you, how are these emerging regulations affecting you as a company?
Well, it's not all bad news. Sometimes it feels it, but it's not all bad news. You know, I mean, if you look at what's happening in the States, for instance, you know, we're accessing, you know, with various partners. I can think of 2 that are going on, one with Cargill, one with ADM, where we're putting money in. They're putting in an equivalent amount, and federal money is then coming in behind it and match funding the combined amount that we're putting in. So we've been able to take 30 million to 60 million to invest in regenerative agriculture in wheat farming, for example. So, you know, but having said that, we're a long way from where we need to be, and again, glass half full, half empty. You're all aware, I know, that on day, what was it? I can't remember what day it was, but anyway, you know, earlier on, the launch of the Emirates Declaration on Resilient Food Systems was truly a game-changing moment, because it puts down very clearly, 135 countries signed it, that they would put food front and center of their NDCs, which is fantastic. We've been talking about that for at least 10 years, if not longer. So that was really good news. But there was another first that came along that day that actually, as far as I know, this has never happened before. No one's been able to tell me differently. On the same day as the Emirates Declaration was released, member states will do this. Along came the non-state actors with a call to action that very same day saying, well done, member states, here's how we're going to put it into practice. That kind of sequenced announcement has never happened before, because at the end of the day, whatever member states do on policy, it's going to be the likes of Rockefeller, it's going to be the likes of Nestle and Diageo, it's going to be the likes of the TNCs of this world who are going to put it into practice, right? So that was a really good thing. And then, of course, then after that, we have the action agenda on regenerative landscapes, which was announced. Now, if you don't know about that, I urge you to find out about it. And the reason why that's important, we're in, a number of companies are in, is because it aims to create a gravitational pull that will affect policymakers, because when we all club together, we're the world's biggest food and beverage company, but we're microscopic compared with the food system. So, but if we come together, we create a gravitational pull for policymakers and for other actors in the food system as well. So we're all going really, really well. And that was kind of happening, you know, we all thought this is, you know, momentum was with us. And then the agriculture negotiations get stuck. So, Sharm el-Sheikh agenda is stuck. So it's a little bit, we feel like we've run into the sand a little bit. And this is a moment, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the call, but there's I think we're up to 800 signatories have called on the negotiators to get their act together on the GST and on the closing statement, given that the agriculture negotiations have stopped. Anything and I mean, it's all very well, we all get together. We're a little bit in our echo chambers here, aren't we? I think we all know, we all hear the same things over and again. Well, what are we going to do about it? And well, maybe we've all got a network that we can influence on this, because we are truly at a point where we don't have time, and we can talk, but we do need the walk. And I think all of us have a role to play in that and find some agency, which wasn't actually what I meant to talk about when I got up here, but somehow or other it feels appropriate to do it.
No, but thank you for doing that, because this is a great example. I mean, collaboration has been a key topic that has been coming back and forth throughout the first week at COP, and so.
Can I just say, and again, some people have heard me say this before, so forgive me for repetition. It's actually collective action that we need. There's enough partnerships that are framed up. Partnerships are almost like, more commitments. There's no accountability for delivery. With action, there's accountability for delivery, and that's what we need now.
Well, then it ties very well to our topic today. So how do we move to the accountability to be able to track progress and allow for deeper regeneration? That is the whole topic of today's session. And Peter, perhaps finishing with you, can you give us, I mean, we've heard a couple of examples of those private-public partnerships, but they're still a bit hindered. What can we do in order to jumpstart those and scale them?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think if I hear the phrase blended finance one more time, I will. Nobody really knows what it means, and what it means, going back to your point, other people doing things. Yeah, exactly. Other people's money and other people doing the hard work and taking the risk as well. Particularly if you're talking about a financial institution, they will expect philanthropy or a government or somebody else to come in, and then they can come in and take the jam. So yeah, what do we need to do to change that? I would love the central system to lead, but I'm afraid that's never going to happen. And your point, Ewan, about landscape finance, I mean, I think that is a framework that has huge potential. Because if you are a financial institution and somebody can come to you and say, there's a group here and there's a location. I mean, they love location because that immediately makes them think they can get a mortgage on something. So that's security. So that starts to get the juices flowing. I think if you can get a group together, which is clearly collective action, not just sort of talking, then the finance can get sucked in much more easily. But, what finance always needs is trust, the financial system. And we saw that back in 2008. All the plumbing of the financial system broke down because suddenly nobody trusted anybody. If you can create that framework for building trust where you can understand the risks and see how they can be shared or spread around or allocated appropriately, that's the point when finance can come in. And the thing about finance, financiers are just riddled with FOMO. Our fear of missing out is just endemic, because if I work for BlackRock and I see, another large financial institution there first, KKR taking the cake, then I want to be there because I'm going to be losing out. My boss will be asking me, why am I not doing that? You mentioned, innovation, we mentioned. An example of innovation, for example, we've talked for a little while about blue bonds in the seafood industry, where you basically raise money to pay fisher people not to fish while the stock of fish is restored. You could do exactly the same structure with regenerative agriculture, because there's that transition period where the farmer, again, we were hearing farmers, they don't like change. And I had a wonderful anecdote. Wonderful thing about COP, you catch cabs with people you've never met before, and you have amazing conversations. I got a cab from the hotel with somebody never met before. She comes from a farming community, and she was saying she knows a neighbor who has farmed carrots and potatoes in a floodplain for years, which is a really stupid thing to do. But his father did it, his grandfather did it, so trying to persuade him to change, really hard. You can persuade people to change if you can say, we're going to de-risk it for you. And that sort of financial structure is potentially something to do. So financial innovation, trust, and landscape financing, I think those are really, really key levers.
Thank you for sharing, Peter. Sarah, perhaps we can end the session with you. Any final words to us as to why this needs to happen, this shift from shallow to deep. We have a lot to lose. The stakes are high. But tell us a bit more.
I think to close it and leave time for questions, there's a really elegant distillation of the why in the work of a fabulous partner called Common Land. And they've created something called the 4 returns framework. And it basically is an alternative to thinking about the much more myopic, just straight up financial return story, which is how investment is made right now to agriculture. So the idea of the 4 returns, and you can apply it to a regenerative farm, regenerative landscape, regenerative community, is first, we are talking about financial returns to nature. So we get carbon, we get biodiversity, we get water. These are externalities right now in the cost of food, but you can put a price to any of these are real values. There's a return to nature. Second, social returns. There's this, it's the largest example of what this all actually looks like in a place is in Andhra Pradesh in India. Community managed natural farming, 1 million farmers doing this. It's extraordinary work. You can talk to Keith and Vijay Kumar and they can paint the picture for you. But, when you look at what happens, you're actually seeing social empowerment. You're seeing women's health. You're seeing an array, a really stunning array of social returns happening. And then financial returns. I think one of the takeaways here from the financial side is if you only look at this in a 12-month timeline, the numbers are scary. There is a time for this transition. For Common Land, they look at the financial returns over 20 years to a landscape. And when you do that, even actually when you take it down to even 5 years, as the analysis we revealed on December 1st here at COP shows, even in Kansas on wheat, you're getting up to 70 to 120% increases in profit if you take a 6 to 10 year time horizon, right? So we just need a little more time, but those financial returns are there. But then what's the 4th return? So we have returns to nature, returns to society, financial returns. The 4th is a return of inspiration. And I think that's part of really the most essential piece of this puzzle. If we don't believe it's possible, if we don't reignite the hope that something as massive, as complex as transitioning the totality of our production systems globally as possible, if we don't meet people like looking at Gerardo there with the cowboy hat in the back, like Wild Kid Farms there in Maryland, doing this in such an extraordinary way so quickly, there's so much inspiration. And when we have that, it also explains why this is a deep story of inclusion, because many communities that have done this for centuries are indigenous communities who never lost that spiritual connection to the land, which is perhaps the most extraordinary source of inspiration. So I think the closing words are, let's unify the 4 returns to this endeavor, which is a transition to regenerative and agroecological food systems.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. Yes, let's open it up for questions. There's a...
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Carlo Fadda from the CGIAR, and I'm leading initiative on regenerative agriculture, so very much interested in this debate. And one of the challenges that I face is the scaling part, because even in neighboring counties in Kenya, we have regenerative pathways that are very different because of customary, etc. And so how do you think about the scaling when you really need to bring locally adapted solutions which are all leading to the same outcomes, which is the 4 returns that Sarah spoke about? And how that can happen, and maybe particularly to Rob, because he has, from a company point of view, where you have a kind of product, procurement process, etc. How can that work in different countries and different contexts from where you get the product that you need to make your stuff?
Thanks. So the scale question is really, it's the challenge. It is the biggest challenge. We're great at pilots, and they, generally speaking, tend to work, but getting them to go to scale is challenging. And I think it's, from our point of view, we work directly with over 500,000 farmers around the world. So people assume that everything was done through the big global traders. And yes, we do buy a lot of ingredients from the Cargills, the ADMs, the Louis Dreyfus, and so on. But we trade directly with over 500,000 farmers. And of course, the point is that we want to go to scale, but every one of those is an individual relationship, and it has to be farmer-centric, therefore patiently farm by farm. I think from my experience, and I don't know if there are farmers in the room, but I'd love to hear from them, frankly, it seems to me that what works best is helping farmers to talk to other farmers. They're going to listen a lot more to a farmer down the road than they will to any procurement person if they can understand what's been done there and why it's working. What we do know is that when we put pilot, I mean, whether it's dairy in Brazil, we've got an example there, 1,200 dairy farmers that we've worked with for a long time, and the regenerative practices piece has come in more recently based on the trust that we've previously built. And in 2 years, we've seen carbon emissions down by 9%. Crucially, we've seen input costs going down and profitability going up. We can point to lower carbon and a 4% increase in profitability. That's the kind of message that we want to work with those farmers to share with others in their community. It's patient, painstaking work, but that's why we want to do it. That's why we work with Diageo. It's why we work with PepsiCo. It's why, hell's bells, we're even working with Kraft Heinz from the Dairy Methane Action Alliance that we just announced. So it's being prepared to put past enmities to one side and work with as many partners who share the same ambition as possible to try and reach the goals that we're striving for. There's a Regen 10 piece of this as well, but maybe we'll save that for another time.
Can I just answer as a farmer?
Please, yeah.
Throw down the gauntlet. I'm Andy McFarlane, New Zealand. I'm Fonterra dairy farmer on the board. But yeah, I mean, the lessons from New Zealand, and I think it applies anywhere in the world, is that I would disagree with one of the comments earlier on that farmers don't like change. I actually think farmers embrace change. They need to see the value proposition.
Totally.
But, the more generations you've been doing the same thing, it's harder to see the value proposition. So the emphasis is on how do you show the value proposition, what's in it for me. The second part there, though, to your question, Rob, is that the early adopters, not the entrepreneurs, no farmers follow entrepreneurs because there's always good reasons not to follow, but they follow that next 10 or 15%. And the top-down approach of being told what to do typically doesn't resonate. So the art and the exercise is getting the big group in the middle to lead that 15%.
Can I respond to that? So I think it's a really great point. So I just want to say, on behalf of Fonterra, thank you and well done. This is another example of how we go to scale, because Fonterra has just published recently, relatively, a net zero roadmap. It takes our net zero roadmap at Nestle and it used it as a form of inspiration, and it's very closely aligned. That's the kind of thing where if you've got that kind of consistency across the planning. So we were thrilled when you launched your net zero roadmap. It was exactly the kind of thing we want to see from the partners that we trade with, because we then have common policies. And I think the point about farmers and change, yeah, there has to be a value proposition. Of course, farmers want to change. They want to be profitable farmers. And another way to the point over here about scale is how do we help young people want to stay? The important thing, that they're profitable farms that are making a positive impact.
Thank you, Rob. This actually is a great way to end this session, and perhaps just by saying that if we want deeper commitments and more regeneration, I heard a couple of points here. First of all, farmer-centric, very much important, and I would say the most important piece of the puzzle. The second piece is convergence, aligning on how do you ask what is needed from farmers. We need this public sector alignment on metrics, but also aligning on frameworks, and all of these efforts are already undergoing today. And this triggers the last point, accountability. Private sector accountability through the corporate accountability and performance system by strengthening it, but also perhaps accountability for other actors, financial institutions and others out there, to give them that last push so that we can all shift these agricultural systems together. So thank you very much for all of our panelists. Thank you for joining this session, and enjoy the rest of the day.